Well, welcome to Speaking of Horses. I'm your host, Wayne Williams, and we're ready to go right here with some of the great stories from the horse industry. So join us as we get ready to go Speaking of Horses right here on this station.
Thanks for being here. I hope to educate you on horse identification, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you might wonder what that might be, and hopefully throughout the talk, please, I welcome any questions. I welcome any input. If you've had information and used identification products yourself, I'd love to embark on that information with you. I'll give you a little quick background of myself. My name, like she said, is Teresa Spencer. I have a company called Equestrisafe. Our company started 9.5 years ago because of the need that I found while living in California for needing identification on my horse during an evacuation of a major wildfire. We found that during those evacuations, when horses showed up at fairgrounds and other locations and even individual ranches, nobody had identification on them. And so a week after the fire or the event happened, people were coming to claim horses. And how do you know who's who? Or horses are on your ranch and nobody's come to claim them. How do you know who's who? So that's part of what I found with California, and now that I've traversed the country over the last 2 years, putting on about 60,000 miles back and forth, I found that this happens in almost every state and with every major disaster. And it doesn't matter whether it's a flood, it's a hurricane, it's a wildfire, or it's tornadoes. This happens with everything. People find horses, locate horses, and they don't have a clue as to where they belong, okay? So my big thing is trying to get you as an owner and your horse back together. That is our objective. So understanding what the classifications are for different identifications. There's brands, and we all know that there's hot brands and there's freeze brands. There's also tattooing, and that's mostly done through organizations and associations. There's also marks on your horse that you can consider as an identification marking. There's swirls and whirls, and we won't go into all of that because that's a whole nother scientific technology that we're not going to talk about. But we will touch on it because I want to mention that on swirls and whirls, every horse is different. It is like a fingerprint, and every horse has a different swirl or whirl, different on their body in different locations. So you can use that as a form of identification. Microchips, absolutely. We're going to talk about microchips and the need for those, and then we're going to talk about visible identification items. So, are we ready to roll? Does anybody have any questions yet? Okay, cool. All right, so origins of brands, they date back to 2700 BC, and it's so that you or I can identify our livestock. It originated with livestock so that ranchers and farmers would know what livestock is theirs and what belonged to other people, and that's how it all started. When we say livestock, we talk about all livestock. Now, they don't normally brand pigs, but they will brand sheep. We don't normally brand goats, but I've seen it happen on them. And then obviously we know the big one, which is cattle, right? Everybody brands cattle. So that's what they are. Brands are harder to recognize state by state, and I'll tell you why. There is no national brand registry. There is a state registry, and there's, I believe it's 9 branding states in the United States. Those states have branding inspectors that go out and check the brands on stock that goes in and out of their states. Other than that, other than those 9 states, there's no other brands available. But that doesn't mean that you can't have a brand. We can all have a brand. We can design our own brand, we can register it with the state, and we can have our own brand. And it's usually a minimal cost of about $25 to register that brand. But you also have to keep that brand registration up. If you die, you don't pay for it, your brand falls off the records. So now your horse gets sold, and somebody wants to find out what the brand is. They have no way of going back to figuring out who originated that brand, or where that brand came from, and where that horse came from. So you do definitely have to keep it up. Unbranded animals back in the day were called slicks. That meant anybody could claim them, anybody could brand them, and now they're yours. That's why branding became so important in the West, because there were so many cattle that were coming up from Mexico that people were just taking them to their ranch and branding them. So that's why brands became really, really effective, especially in the West. Identifying a brand, well, we all know that Mustangs, that's the top picture there. How many of you don't know what a Mustang brand looks like from the BLM? See? So that's what a Mustang, it's very identifiable. We all know where they're at. They're on the left side of the neck. They're always a freeze brand. They always start with an L, you know, and then they break down to where they're captured, what they attempt their age at, and so forth. That's what that brand is. Ranchers brands, those are all different. There's a whole different method to those. And then there's also different types of brands for a mare and a gelding, too, that ranchers used to put on. So that they could look out in the field without going like this and find out which one's a mare and which one's a gelding. So there's those that happen. Now, ranch brands and breeder brands are just that. They are ranch brands or breeder brands. So if you're raising horses, you're going to have a breeder brand. If you're raising cattle, you're going to have a ranch brand. Okay? Here's kind of, you can see the big graphic there with all the brands on it. So there's a typical rocking something, there's a typical bar something, there's a typical lazy something, whatever that is. Those are kind of typical, arrows and so forth, but this kind of is an old school brands. There's triangles, there's squares, there's diamonds, there's hearts, there's all kinds of different brands. What I've listed there on the left is where the typical brands are located when you go to brand. Now when you register your brand, if you decide to get your own brand and you register it, that's part of the registration process, is you have to tell them where that brand's going to be located. And honestly, recently I have heard and seen that horses are being branded on the inside of their thigh. And the reason for that, if somebody steals your horse, they're going to see an outside brand, typically on the hip or the shoulder, the jaw, or wherever it's placed. But most people aren't going to look on the inside of a thigh. So you can have your horse branded on the inside of a thigh, and that way it's just less visible, but it's more identifiable for you. Okay? So these are the typical locations: the hip, the rump, the stifle, the ribs, the jaw. And when I say that, brands have their own language. As you can see, they definitely have their own language of what's what. Yes, ma'am?
May I ask a question?
Yes.
I thought the idea of branding, especially in horses, was to prevent theft. I thought it was a deterrent if a horse was branded. Is that not the case? Versus the inside of the thigh, I'm thinking then you don't see it and it's less noticeable. So wouldn't that also kind of hinder the efforts to recover your horse if it is
It can, but it can also be extremely identifiable, because I know some people who have had dogs stolen that they tattoo the inside of their thigh with like their birth date or the owner's birth date, and nobody knew about it except for the owner, and even the person that sold the dog never even knew that it was tattooed on the inside, and they recovered the dog because they were able to see the tattoo on the inside. So same thing goes with a brand on the outside. If somebody stole your horse and they thought it was a typical sorrel horse, and they stole your horse and you walked up and said, no, my horse is branded on the inside of the thigh, and they go, yeah, right. They didn't bother to look, but you knew that. You could walk right up to that horse and go, there you go, it's right there. Okay, that's an identifiable mark. Just like I'll talk about that with color and patterns, it's an identifiable mark. So the more information that you have on your horse, the more information that you keep on your horse, the better off you are in the event that they are taken, stolen, lost, recovered by somebody else, and never turned back to you. Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome. Associations. So these are some of the associations that use lip tattoos. Lip tattoos are great. As you can see, I got a beautiful example of one that we could actually read. Okay? Give it about 5 years, and you probably won't be able to read it very well. But if you do have a horse with a lip tattoo, you can contact any one of these associations if you know the breeding of the horse, and see if they can identify who that horse belonged to, where it was bred, where it came from, and so forth. If it's a racehorse, any one of these are racehorses, believe it or not. If it's a racehorse, then you can find the race history as well, if you know what that lip tattoo is. So lip tattoos are very identifiable for horses, and they're used quite commonly among associations. Not usually by us, typically in the private sector. Markings. Markings and coat. As you can see, this horse is very identifiable, right? He looks like he's part brindle, okay? So any identifiable markings on your horse are extremely important for you to keep track of. And one of the things I tell people is wash your horse, take pictures of it, front, back, sideways, upside down, over the top, any way that you can. If your horse has something special, like I just lost my mare, and she had a nick in her ear. So she had an accident and a nick was taken out of her ear. That's extreme, and she was a red sorrel. No white on her at all. If somebody took her, that's the way I would identify her, is by the nick in her ear. Okay? So it's very important to take care of markings and know what your horse looks like. My common question that people ask me is, well, I would know my horse in a heartbeat. I said, really? You put your bay horse in with 70 other bay horses loose in an arena. I don't care if they've got white on them or not. Turn them all loose in the arena and stand out in the middle and try to identify your horse. Chances are you're going to have a very, very difficult time, unless there's something really specific going on with his coat, okay, or a weird star or something. So know your horse and keep track of what they have. I also tell people a lot of times, now I have a colt back home in California, that on the inside of his hind leg, his left hind, he has two what looks like paint drip marks that go down into his stocking. Do you think I have pictures of that everywhere? Absolutely, I have pictures of that everywhere. So if something ever happened to that colt, I know that I can go identify him by those two drip marks. Photograph, 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 photograph. This is what we're talking about. Photograph them dirty, photograph them clean, photograph them top to bottom, side to side, over the top, underneath, I don't care. There's a lot of horses out there that are registered breeding stock paint. Okay? You couldn't tell, as I was standing here looking out in that arena, you cannot tell that that horse is a paint horse until that paint rolls.
Well, that's our show. I'm your host, Wayne Williams. Speaking of horses, we'll be back next week with a brand new show. Or join us at speakingofhorses.com.